Right here in my messages and recent messages in Grace Life, I've been slowly going through the book of 1 Corinthians. And I'm partway through chapter 7. And you as the audience are too. That's what I want to look at today. In this passage, Paul is commenting about divorce. Some members of the congregation here have been divorced, but as far as I know, no one is thinking of getting divorced. So what I say is not pointed at anybody in particular. But I address it in the belief that what God has inspired Paul to write, and what he's inspired to be in the New Testament writings, is in the long range helpful for us. Perhaps it will be helpful because of a future divorce or some other principle that's involved there. Divorce is a difficult question, and almost all churches have had to wrestle with it because the Bible seems to forbid it in some verses, and other verses seem to allow it. Some churches have taught that divorce should never be allowed, or if it happens, then remarriage is not allowed. But then some remarried people become Christians, and the church has to figure out what to do with them. What's the Christian thing to do? Do we tell them to break up the second marriage in order to go back to the first? Well, some have done that, ironically requiring a divorce in order to say that divorce is bad. However, if they could figure out how the first divorce was maybe invalid, then we could allow the second marriage to stay intact. So there was kind of a legal maneuverings going on to try to deal with this complex social problem. It can get convoluted sometimes, and that caused churches to rethink their approach. Many denominations had to go through the same process. One of the key scriptures for reevaluation is found here in 1 Corinthians 7. So we'll see what Paul wrote about it starting in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10. I'll read from the New International Version. To the married, he says, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. What caused Paul to address this subject? Most of his letter to Corinth addresses questions that they already had, questions they asked him, or in some cases a leader from Corinth brought their letter to Paul and described for him what was going on so that he was able to address the problems that they had one by one. Apparently in Corinth there were some women who thought that the Christian thing to do would be to separate from their husbands. Well, what would make them think that? Apparently they thought that spirit was good and matter was bad. That idea went back to Plato, and it was enjoying a revival in the first century. There are other key clues in the letter that tell us that that kind of thing is going on there. So if you want to be more spiritual, you have to be less physical. In this case, less sex. That might have been the reason that some people, some of the men in Corinth were visiting prostitutes. Their wives were separating themselves to be more spiritual. Whatever the reason, Paul says, don't do it. He says, this command is actually from Jesus. In Mark 10, Jesus said that a woman should not divorce her husband and marry somebody else. Well, these women in Corinth had no intention of marrying anybody else, but Paul is just saying they shouldn't get divorced. Now, a few verses later, he's going to give a situation in which divorce is allowed. So we have to understand that what he writes here is in a specific context. In this case, as far as we can tell, of women who wanted to separate from their husbands in order to be more spiritual. So he says, no, don't do that. Jesus would tell you not to. You don't have to abstain from sex in order to be more spiritual. That's not the Christian thing to do. And then he says in verse 11, says, well, if she insists on doing this, well, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. So Paul recognizes that even if the Lord forbids it, some people might do it anyway. In such cases, the church is supposed to tolerate it and not kick them out. There are some sins that call for church discipline, but apparently this isn't one of them. I'm not encouraging any women to do this. No. If she separates, okay, but she's not supposed to marry anybody else, he says. And then Paul adds a similar rule for the men. And the husband should not divorce his wife. Throughout this chapter, he's saying that men and women should live by the same rules. There's no favoritism for one or the other. The men probably didn't bring up the idea of being more spiritual by being non-sexual, but Paul addresses this possibility just in case. The rule for men is the same as the rule for women. Then in verse 12, Paul addresses a different circumstance. To the rest, he says, or to the others, I say, I am not the Lord. If any believer has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Jesus never made this rule. Jesus never addressed the possibility that believers were going to be married to unbelievers. So Paul is making up the rule here is based on what he understands is the Christian thing to do. If a believer is married to an unbeliever, and it's not a reason to get divorced. So he's talking about the others, the rest. It's a different category of people than what he was talking about earlier. In this verse, it's believers married to unbelievers. It tells us that in the earlier verse, he was talking about believers married to believers who wanted to separate from them. But in verse 12, he's talking about mixed marriages. And it says, you can be spiritual even when married to somebody who isn't spiritual. Or, to be more blunt, you can have sex with an unbelieving spouse, and it won't make you less of a Christian. It's Christian to be faithful to your marriage obligations. If your spouse is happy to live with you, then stay married. And in verse 13, he flip-flops it to say that there are equal rules for women as well as men. And if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Now that leads him to the question of what happens when the spouse does not consent, when the spouse is not happy to live with the believer. Paul will address that soon, but before that, in verse 14, he wants to explain why he's giving the advice that he is. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. Well, this explanation leads to a bunch of questions of its own. What does it mean that a person can be made holy simply by being married to a believer? What if they live like the devil? Are they still holy? Does it mean they'll be saved? I don't think Paul meant that. He'll soon say that such people need to be saved. So we conclude that they're not saved now, but yet they are holy. They're some sort of in-between category. But we don't know the practical implications of that, except it's okay to remain married to them. And what does it mean that your children are holy? Does that mean they'll be saved? No, apparently not. Paul doesn't address questions like what happens if you have children outside of marriage? Are those children holy? I guess that they are, but does it mean that the other parent is also holy? If so, what does that mean? Practically, well, we really don't know. This is the only place the Bible teaches this. We don't have enough details here to be sure what he's saying about it, except it's okay to remain married to an unbeliever. Being holy doesn't mean that we have to separate ourselves from all unbelievers. You probably already knew that. But here it's part of Paul's explanation for why we shouldn't divorce our spouses just for being unbelievers. Being an unbeliever is not a breach of contract. It doesn't cancel our marriage obligations. But then the question is, what if the unbelieving spouse wants a divorce? Paul answers that in verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. So if they want to leave, we can accept their decision. We couldn't really stop them anyway. And Paul says that the believer is not bound. What does it mean, not bound? Does it mean a legal separation, or does it mean a divorce with the right of remarriage? Well, if the unbeliever wants to leave, we can't really stop them. Paul doesn't need to give permission for that. It happens outside of our control. So when he says not bound, it apparently means that the person is not bound to the marriage anymore. That means they can marry somebody else. Paul is giving them permission to get on with their life, not be constrained by somebody who doesn't even want to be a part of their life anymore. If the unbelieving husband says, I don't want to be your husband anymore, Paul says we can accept that. That man is not a husband. You're not bound to him. You have freedom. Or as Paul says here, you are called to peace. So Paul has dealt with a couple of situations based on the circumstances of the people in Corinth. But real life doesn't always fall into two neat categories. There are all sorts of complications that can enter the picture. Complications such as marriages that were fraudulent from the beginning, people who've been living together for a long time, or marriages that have deteriorated so much that the word marriage doesn't really describe it anymore. In a sinful world, relationships can get very messy. In the church, we can't always untangle the mess. We have to remember that God has called us to peace. We also want to remember that God has called us to be faithful to our marriages. In marriage, we make a commitment to the other person. As a church, we don't want to encourage people to break those commitments. If people have formed new commitments, we don't want to encourage them to break the new commitments. In practical terms, it means we accept people in the marriage circumstances that they have. We're not endorsing what they did in the past, but we let them go forward as best they can. In some ways, the administrative problem the churches face, not just our church, but any church, begins with the word of Jesus when he taught that anyone who divorced was sinning. We can see that in Mark 10 and verse 11. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Now, that seems pretty clear. If you divorce, you sin. No exceptions. Whoever does it sins. But it's not the end of the story. Matthew 19 tells us more in verse 9. But I say to you, this is the same Jesus talking, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and remarries another commits adultery. So there's an exception. In Mark 10, a prohibition is stated without any exceptions being noted. In Matthew 19, an exception is mentioned. So we conclude that a rule can be phrased in a sweeping way without any exceptions being noted, and yet exceptions are allowed. Jesus says that unchastity is an exception. That's a pretty broad term to be adultery or other things. Could there be other exceptions that Jesus didn't mention? Apparently so. Paul says there is an exception if the unbeliever initiates the divorce. Could there be further exceptions? Perhaps so. We have no guarantee that between Jesus and Paul that all possible exceptions are mentioned. So there might be more. The church today has come to allow further exceptions, such as in the cases of abuse. So there are two conflicting principles at work. On one side, we want to uphold the value of marriage, of keeping a lifelong commitment to the other person. And this is not just a religious value, but it's supported by sociological research as well. Children do best when they grow up in a stable family. Now, some children in stable families grow up to be criminals, and some children in remarriages turn out to be great. But on average, stability produces better results than instability. However, the second principle is that children do better in peaceful families than in turmoil and abuse. A marriage in which there's constant violence, for example, is not the kind of stability that helps children grow. So when a marriage has gone bad, it's difficult to say what's going to be best for the children, whether to stay in a bad family or to have the disruption of tearing a family apart. We don't know enough about human behavior to know when the one is worse than the other, and it's probably going to be different for different people. What's the church supposed to do in this complex situation? We don't have a perfect pipeline to knowing what's best. We can point people to the virtue of being faithful, but faithfulness can be seen in different ways. In some cases, it's faithful to the marriage vows of sticking together in sickness and in health, and poverty and in plenty. And in other cases, faithfulness means protecting our children from a parent who's become dangerous to them. In some cases, love means putting up with personal discomfort. In other cases, staying in a marriage means that a cycle of sin gets worse. Sin so thoroughly fills our society and is found in believers too, that the church can't make hard and fast rules about what's best in each situation. It's good to counsel about the problem, but we can't make the decisions for you. You're the one who has to live with the consequences. In most cases, there's going to be unpleasant consequences no matter what you do. Sin hurts innocent people. Broken marriages hurt. Broken promises hurt. Adultery hurts. Abuse hurts. All these dysfunctions hurt. We can't change that. And we can't predict which of them is going to hurt more or to hurt other people more. In this world, bad things happen to good people, even to believers, and sometimes we just have to do the best we can in a bad situation. The good news, as Paul says here, is that God has called us to peace. We don't always get peace the way we want it, but that's still the goal. If we've made bad decisions in the past, God has forgiven us. He calls us to peace. We don't need to agonize over what would have happened if I had done this or if I had done that. We don't need to torture ourselves with would have, could have, should have. It's in the past, and we need to go forward. God forgives us and calls us peace. We do our best, but we trust in Christ. He's the answer to our pain and to all the convoluted problems that we get ourselves into. Now, Christ is not just a rescue superhero who parachutes into our lives to fix the problems. He's also our Creator and our Lord, who tells us what we should do, how to change our ways, how to improve our responses. He doesn't just work on the external circumstances, but He works inside of us, inside our soul and spirit, and we have an ongoing relationship with Him. He walks with us in our pain. Sometimes He takes our pain away instantly, but most often He helps us through it. That has two meanings. Not only does He help us get through it, but He also helps it help us. But always He calls us to peace. That means freedom from guilt and shame. It means patience and long-suffering. It means we have to trust Him, even when we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death and despair. He calls us to peace.